Welcome back to Sunday Night in America. If a Salvation Army kettle was stolen, we would be outraged. If gifts intended for needy children were taken, people would condemn it. Why should it be any different when your tax dollars intended for those in need are stolen by grifters?
In late 2025 and into early 2026, federal law enforcement, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, found itself at the center of one of the most politically charged and complex domestic enforcement operations in recent memory. What began with allegations of fraud in Minnesota's social services and federally funded programs quickly escalated into a sprawling national security and law enforcement effort that has drawn in thousands of agents, multiple federal agencies, state officials, civil rights advocates, the U.S. Department of Justice, the FBI, Treasury investigators, and everyday citizens across several states. At the heart of the matter was the exposure of fraud networks that federal prosecutors and Homeland Security officials described as both massive in scale and deeply embedded in certain communities. What federal officials characterize as widespread fraud in Minnesota's welfare, childcare, and disability support programs has since become a flashpoint for a national debate, political conflict, and an unprecedented federal enforcement surge, with ripple effects reaching as far as Ohio. Before we move ahead, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more updates. The controversy began in Minnesota, where a series of fraud investigations, some long ongoing and others sparked by new allegations, revealed patterns of alleged misuse of federal funds meant to serve vulnerable populations.
Almost feel bad for the guy, except for the fact that he should have seen this. And whether there was something criminal, whether he was aware of the fraud, which would be criminal, or whether he simply looked the other way, it's a massive, massive failure of government. The Trump administration, by the way, we've already sent hundreds and hundreds of additional people, of resources that are starting to investigate this stuff, get to the bottom of it. Stephen Miller sent people who are literally going door to door at some of these fraudulent daycare centers and trying to understand just how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Federal prosecutors and investigators asserted that tens of millions and potentially billions of dollars intended for social services, child nutrition, pandemic relief, and disability support had been siphoned through shell companies, fictitious service providers, and fraudulent billing schemes. Prosecutors in the District of Minnesota described cases where fraud exceeded hundreds of millions of dollars in individual schemes, and where programs like the Feeding Our Future nonprofit, responsible for distributing child nutrition funds during the COVID-19 pandemic, were central to these scams. Prosecutors alleged that Feeding Our Future had submitted fabricated attendance records, exaggerated service claims, and false documentation to draw down federal dollars, even though the services were never genuinely provided.
Mr. Secretary, the federal government is big. Many argue it's too big. And the bigger something is, the more places fraud has to hide. How can we prevent or root out fraud before it takes place?
Well, Trey, good evening. It's so good to be with you. Thank you for your service to our country and now getting the message out to the American people. You're exactly right. During the Biden administration, man, it was just gross negligence, fraud, waste, and abuse. You know, I saw the clip you showed the vice president. I'm so glad that he's appointed now a new associate attorney general to root out this fraud, not only in Minnesota, but around the country. During the Biden administration, it was negligence. It was a lack of stewardship, a lack of financial controls that were put in place. And as you alluded to, that's what happens when the government grows, is that they're turning a blind eye. And so now we're making sure that we increase our verification systems. We have boots on the ground there in Minnesota. I know at HUD, not only have we found waste and fraud and abuse, but we have been very intentional going forward to hold people accountable, not only that have done this before, but to put people on notice that going forward we are paying attention.
Federal sentencing records showed multiple defendants connected to these schemes being convicted or pleading guilty, and in some instances funneling proceeds out of the country. Some of these investigations revealed operations involving counterfeit companies and managers who exploited the design of state programs for profit. Federal filings detailed how operators recruited beneficiaries, falsified paperwork, and turned federally supported assistance into personal wealth and lavish lifestyles. Federal prosecutors alleged that certain figures associated with these fraud networks ran organizations that, on paper, functioned as service providers but, in reality, offered little if any authentic services to eligible recipients. These revelations would lead to dozens of federal charges, hundreds of subpoenas, and a broader federal examination of how allegedly fraudulent billing networks could have operated for years without sufficient detection. While these fraud investigations had been underway for some time, national attention dramatically intensified when a widely viewed social media video went viral in December 2025. An independent journalist and online personality published clips alleging the child care centers run by Somali Americans in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area had received millions in public funds without actually serving children, showing seemingly empty facilities and questioning the operations of federally funded programs. The video quickly amassed tens of millions of views and became a rallying point for conservative activists and some lawmakers who claimed it represented but a glimpse of far larger fraud networks embedded in social services programs. Homeland Security and the FBI responded by publicizing ongoing investigations into fraud across Minnesota's Medicaid and welfare services. Federal agencies confirmed that Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, a division of DHS, along with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and other federal law enforcement components.
During the Biden administration, man, it was just gross negligence, fraud, waste, and abuse. You know, I saw the clip you showed with the vice president. I'm so glad that he's appointed now a new associate attorney general to root out this fraud, not only in Minnesota, but around the country. During the Biden administration, it was negligence. It was a lack of stewardship, a lack of financial controls that were put in place. And as you alluded to, that's what happens when the government grows, is that they're turning a blind eye. And so now we're making sure that we increase our verification systems. We have boots on the ground there in Minnesota. I know at HUD, not only have we found waste and fraud and abuse, but we have been very intentional going forward to hold people accountable, not only that have done this before, but to put people on notice that going forward, we are paying attention.
All right, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. The new housing czar in New York, Comrade Weaver, believes home ownership is a tool of white supremacy.
We're deploying agents to Minnesota to conduct site visits, review records, and pursue both fraud and immigration violations where they intersected. Then came one of the most remarkable deployments of federal agents into a U.S. city in recent history. Homeland Security announced that approximately 2,000 federal agents, including ICE deportation officers, HSI investigators, and Customs and Border Protection specialists, had been mobilized to the Twin Cities region in January 2026 for what officials described as a combined immigration enforcement and fraud investigation operation. Federal officials framed the deployment as a necessary response to systemic fraud and lawlessness, citing hundreds, and, in some accounts, more than 1,000, arrests of people connected to various crimes during these operations, including individuals with outstanding removal orders and violent criminal histories. The agency described this as one of the largest immigration and enforcement missions ever undertaken by DHS, emphasizing that the presence of federal officers was intended to disrupt criminal activity, safeguard taxpayer funds, and hold accountable those defrauding federal programs. Before we leave, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more updates. We will catch you in the next one.